So this is one of the few times, in fact, I think one of the only times, where we see Jesus in a mixed group telling a parable to one group and then turning and telling a parable to a different group in the same gathering. So, and it's very evident that he does this. So, real quick, since this is our last kind of lesson in this, I could do a couple of more, but we're kind of seeing the pattern. Jesus only tells something like 20 parables, and a lot of them are repeated. So once you've seen it, you've seen it. But let's take a review. What is a parable? I define it. Like, what is a parable?
They're like a story that teaches something.
Teaches a lesson.
Yep. Okay. So, technical term is didactic. So it's a didactic story. Something that is didactic is meant to teach or impart a lesson. Okay. What else? Generally speaking.
Sort of, he uses it to hide truth.
Okay.
So that people don't know what he's talking about sometimes. So that he gives people the opportunity to delve into it and try to understand the mystery of it.
Okay.
People like to watch mysteries on the television
Mm-hmm.
and try to solve the mysteries.
Yep. Okay.
Well, he sort of gives an opportunity for that.
Are they generic or specific? Generally speaking. What I mean by that is the content of them. Is it generic or is it more specific? So by generic, what I mean is, could the characters be anybody, or are they specific characters? They're more general, and the reason they're more general is because you're supposed to find yourself in the story, which is why Lazarus and the rich man, we've talked about this before, is an odd tale because it's the one parable that has a named character. Otherwise, all the characters are very nondescript, right? So they're very general in the way that they're told as far as the characters are concerned because they're supposed to be more free-form. They're also what we call archetypal. And you'll remember this because a lot of these parables that Jesus is telling, he's adopting from the Midrash and the Talmud and the Mishnah. There are these stories that are in there that are archetypes or forms that people are already familiar with. And so in very common rabbinic style, he might change what the story sounds like, but the form of the story will stay the same. And we've seen that in some of the parables that we've looked at, like the lost son. We've seen that parable. We can see where Jesus pulls that parable from. The rich man and Lazarus, we talked about, I think it was last week, where Jesus pulls that from. We've seen even the rich man who's got the talents, the one about stewardship. We've seen where Jesus pulls that from. So Jesus is pulling from a common type of understanding in these different teachings, and he's tailoring the story to fit what he wants it to teach. Okay? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like we all know of, we'd call it maybe the Romeo and Juliet archetype, right? Star-crossed lovers is what that type of story is called. We all look at Romeo and Juliet and we see these star-crossed lovers who are in love but are never going to be together, right? And Romeo and Juliet's a prime example of that. Tristan and Isolde is another one of those stories that's very much like that. But it's an archetypal story that we know, and that's why we call it a star-crossed lover's story, because we instantly know the form that that story is probably going to take. Okay? When we look at a revenge story, instantly what are you thinking if I say a revenge story? Well, you're thinking about a guy who's been wronged, who is seeking to correct that wrong by any means necessary, right? That's the archetype that pops into your head. When I say a comedy, what do you think of? Something funny, right? The characters are going to get themselves into funny situations. I can further define that if I say rom-com, romantic comedy. So there's going to be an element of love in there. If I say sitcom, situational comedy, right? If I say slapstick, okay, now you're thinking more like Home Alone. So that's going to tell you what kind of archetype you're thinking of. These stories are meant to hearken the people that are hearing them back to these archetypes that they find in the material that they deal with in their modern era, or in their era. So again, Mishnah, Midrash, Talmud, all these stories, and even some that maybe don't really seem like they fit, but they do, are generally coming from source material that Jesus is retailoring to fit his purposes. There are some that Jesus comes up with that we can't find anywhere, and so those are some of the ones that he's making up on his own. But a majority of the ones that we see are the ones where he's retooling something. Okay, all right. So in these ones, I couldn't find any in the Mishnah and the Talmud or in the Midrash. So he's probably telling these to, that doesn't mean that they're not there, but my guess would be that he's telling these kind of as one who's telling these kinds of stories for the first time, but we see some common elements. All right, so in chapter 18, you're going to have to back up a little bit to find who's in the audience. Okay, so let's do our little diagram here. All right. So who's Jesus talking to? Pharisees. Okay, who else might be Jesus talking to there? Well, that's what he's telling us.
The disciples.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely disciples.
Yep. So we've got Pharisees, we've got disciples. He's in a village, right? So he's probably talking to, remember, he's just healed the 10 lepers, and that's kind of been a big deal in this town. So he's likely talking to some other people, all right? So as we read these stories, remember, each of these is going to be told to two different groups of people. And you'll see the target audience as we read these. Okay, let's look at the Pharisee and the tax collector. Actually, let's look at the persistent widow. It's the first one. And he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always pray and not lose heart. All right, so that's the audience to whom he is telling this parable. That could be the disciples and anybody else standing there. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in the city who kept coming to him and saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he refused, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice. Can we shut the door, please? I will give her justice so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? For will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, the Son of Man comes. Will he find faith on the earth? Okay, so who are our characters here? Huh? What characters?
The character is the widow,
The widow, okay. I'll put her in group 2.
the judge,
The judge, okay, I'll put him in group 3. Okay.
and the opponent, the person who's trying to.
Well, we don't see the adversary in the story though. He's just mentioned. All right? So who is this parable being told to? That would be the disciples and the others that are there. Okay? Who are the disciples and the others akin to?
The widow.
The widow. Okay, so there's a direct correlation here. All right, now, who would the judge be akin to? No. What does Jesus say? God. Okay? But there is a compare and contrast here, right? They're not total equals. The man that is the judge says he neither fears God nor respects man. Is that something that God does? No. But what does God do that is similar to what the judge does? He dispenses justice. The judge does so reluctantly because she doesn't want to be bothered by the woman anymore. God does so why? Because of faith, right? Because the persistence of the woman. The widow is showing a high degree of persistence in the way that she is constantly coming to this judge. And that persistence, Jesus connects with faith. Right? So he's telling the disciples and the others there in light of what the lepers have just gone through. The lepers have been praying for healing, for restoration, because when you were a leper, you were on the outcast of society. You couldn't go into town. You had to live in a colony separate, die alone, and penniless usually. You couldn't go to temple. You couldn't go to synagogue. You were declared unclean, even if somehow you managed to overcome the disease. If you weren't restored all the way physically, you still couldn't go into the temple because you're not allowed to go in there with deformities. Leprosy is a flesh-eating disease. Fingers fall off, hands fall off, ears fall off, lips fall off, eyelids fall off. You couldn't go into the temple with any kind of deformities. So they were praying for restoration. And Jesus does what for the 10 lepers? He heals them. Grants their request just like a good judge. Okay? But it's because of their faith. It's because they kept asking. And this time when they asked God incarnate, God grants their request. Right?
And yet sometimes people die.
Yep.
Regardless.
Right.
Of great faith.
Right? Because there's 2 different ways that God can answer that request, right?
Right.
He can heal you here on earth, or he can heal you when you go home. Okay? But this widow is persistent, knocking on his door every day. Give me justice. Give me justice. All right? So we're told to be like the widow. We're also encouraged that the judge that we are going to is not like the judge in the story. He's a just and righteous and loving and holy God, holy judge that we can trust to make good judgments. Okay? So do not give up praying. That's the whole point. Remember, he says the whole reason he tells this parable, and he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. So, again, he just got done healing the 10 lepers. That's for the disciples, for the others that are there. What's interesting about the 10 lepers, if you can remember the story, only one comes back. You think if you just got healed from a disease, not only healed, but he says, go to the priest and have him declare you clean according to the law of Moses, right? He didn't just heal them. He physically restored them to the point where they could go into the temple and go through a ritual cleansing. And only one came back and said thank you. All right. Anyway, okay. So any questions on this particular parable? Again, it's very short. It's very to the point. Jesus actually kind of says what he means here. The parable is only maybe 2 or 3 sentences long. He gives an explanation for it even. Yeah. Yep. Yep. So it's a rhetorical question. He's asking, will I find this kind of faith on the earth? For some, yes. For very few, yes. For most, no. Okay? So it's almost like a little bit of a lament that Jesus is giving. So, anyway. All right. Any other questions on that one? Yeah.
Do we know if the actual leprosy wasn't the other that like Miriam had was wrong?
No, this is it. Yeah, there's a very specific word for leprosy, which is why they translate it leper. Yeah, there's hang on, I'll tell you what it is. Yeah, I mean it's leproi. I mean it's that's where we get the Greek word is leproi, leprosy. I mean it even kind of looks like it. Lepers. So leproi. Yeah. So this actually refers to the skin disease of leprosy. So we lift it right out of the Greek and we leprosy. We do it like that. But yeah. All right. So that one. All right. Then we'll look at story number 2. All right. So this is story number 1. Now, what is another way that we can know that there are others here other than just the disciples? You have to read down a little bit.
Right after verse 8, it says the Pharisees and the publicans.
Right. So, well, yeah, that's the next parable. But even then, in verse 15, there are little children that are starting to come up and run up and try to come to Jesus. And the disciples are like, no. And Jesus is like, let them come to me, right? So there are other people than just the disciples. So that's kind of, again, context clues are really important for us in determining who these audiences are. So we see the disciples and the others. And now we're going to read this next one. So this is parable 1. Now we're going to look at parable 2. All right. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Who now is group 1? The Pharisees and the scribes. Or the lawyers, depending on how you want to. All right, so we kind of know that like just from the outset. All right, 2 men. Verse 10. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee was standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. All right. So who are our group? Who's our first set of characters here? Who's our first character? That's a Pharisee. He's not trying to hide it this time. Who's in group 3 now? Tax collector. All right. And who's in group 4? God. Still God. Okay. All right. So clearly there's a link here. Again, Jesus is not even trying to hide it. And there's a link here. And we'll talk about what that link is later. What does the Pharisee, what are the things that he is saying? Like, can you connect those to things you know about the Pharisees and their beliefs, their behaviors, what they did? Can you think of anything?
The measuring up thing.
Yep. They're comparing themselves to other men. They like to do that a lot. They had a series of rules and regulations. They call it a fence post around the law. So here's the law of Moses, right? That's the 10 Commandments. That's 613 other laws. All right. Around the law, they built this man-made tradition. Okay? This is a fence. That's what they called it. Can you think of some of the things that would maybe be on the fence or part of the fence? How far you could travel on the Sabbath. Okay, what else?
What you're supposed to wash?
Hand washing. That's another one. Yep. Okay. Can you think of another one?
What kind of food you could eat?
Company you kept.
How much you can carry?
Well, that'd be Sabbath day travel restrictions, all that. Okay.
How much spices you're supposed to tie?
The type of tithe, yeah. So tithing, there are certain tithing restrictions that you had on there. Yep. Okay. So some of those, but all of these restrictions were to keep you from accidentally breaking the law. Do you remember what Moses says about the law at the end of Deuteronomy? He says, "Today I give you this commandment, and it is not too hard for you to keep." All right? Yet, they felt like they had to put this fence around it because it was too hard to keep. So we're going to make a whole bunch of other simpler rules to follow so that we don't accidentally transgress the law. Moses said it was easy to keep. Just do it, right? Now, for us, that might seem like a lot, but these people lived and breathed the law from the time they were young. So they had it imprinted on their hearts. They knew it backwards and forwards. All right. Tax collector. What do we know about tax collectors in the ancient world?
Very well liked.
They were reviled. Yeah. Heavy. And what do we know about Romans? The Romans didn't like to learn the more barbaric tongues. Okay? They had two main languages that they spoke. Anybody knows what those were? Greek and Latin. Okay? They would learn Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that if they really had no other choice. Really. But they refused to learn those. And so they would hire, to make it easier, Jews to go collect taxes from Jews. That way, there wouldn't be a language barrier. Some of the Jews didn't speak Greek. They would only speak Aramaic or Hebrew. So you had to have somebody like a Matthew, okay, who not only spoke Greek and could communicate to the Romans, but could also speak Hebrew and Aramaic. All right? Jesus likely spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. He may have spoken Latin. That's kind of on the outside. So really, when you wanted to, as a tradesman, who remembers what Jesus was? Jesus was a tecton, which is a craftsman. Generally, we would consider stonemason. Carpenter is a little, especially in that area, that's a little But stonemason, carpenter, that's kind of what that word refers to. Somebody who works with their hands and builds things. As we know, Joseph was probably wealthy. because he was a good craftsman, at least according to church tradition. And so he likely built, and we see this kind of reflected in the Passion of the Christ when Jesus is building a commissioned table from a Roman officer, right? So they're kind of tapping into that church tradition. Because, if you got a commission from a Roman officer as a Jew, that meant you made a high quality product that was highly sought after, and you were a highly skilled craftsman, which means you got paid a lot.
What language did he most probably speak in Egypt when he's growing up? When he had
Greek?
Greek.
Okay, so remember, Alexander the Great. He starts off in Macedonia, which was Greece, right? He consolidates the powers in the Greek island area, and he moves on into Asia Minor. So think Turkey, places like that. He expands east into the Persian Empire and then swings down into Egypt. He conquers Egypt by basically saying, I'll make a better king than that Darius guy over there. They welcome him in, they crown him as pharaoh, and the first thing he does is commission a city. Anybody know what city? Alexandria. Big library there, big center of learning. But consequently, what language does Alexander bring with him? Greek. Alexander then leaves Egypt, and starts continuing to push west until he enters into Babylon. So from Macedonia to Babylon to Egypt, what language is now being spoken is kind of the universal standard? Greek. Alexander then continues to push east until he gets to India, and that's where he stopped. Do you know what we still find on the outskirts of India? Greek ruins. So Alexander is really responsible for spreading Greek as a language all over what would one day be the Roman Empire and kind of beyond. So the language that they would have spoken in Egypt would have been Greek, and there still would have been Jews in Egypt. So Hebrew and Aramaic probably would have also been spoken. But really, that's a Greek-heavy area, especially around Alexandria. And we don't know exactly where they went in Egypt, but it's likely they would have gone somewhere, a large city like Memphis, Egypt, Cairo, kind of those areas, or what becomes Cairo. So Greek, because Greek was the lingua franca. It's kind of like, we only need to really know one language because English is the lingua franca of today. So it's the trade language. That's what Greek was the trade language. Okay, so the tax collector, Matthew, is speaking Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, maybe Latin, maybe. All we know is he's highly educated. But tax collectors were seen as a traitor to their people because they gave up any kind of semblance of community or anything. They were ostracized because you're working for the colonizing oppressor, right? It's kind of how they viewed that. So you are no longer welcome, which is what makes it so interesting that Jesus looks at a tax collector and says, come follow me. What I never understood is why Jesus didn't make Matthew the money guy.
Yeah.
He's an accountant. I mean, that just makes sense, right? Aramaic, yep. Aramaic, yes. So Aramaic, you'll still hear Hebrew. You'll also hear what is more commonly referred to as Yiddish. So a lot of that stuff still survives today. Yeah. In fact, Aramaic has had a pretty big influence on modern Hebrew, from what I've read. So, yes. But Aramaic, yeah. Still alive and well. Yeah. That's how we know what it sounded like. So, or how we know in the Passion of the Christ, all they're speaking is Aramaic. So it uses the same Hebrew alphabet, uses very similar constructions and verbs and stuff like that. Yeah. So the tax collectors were vile. What does a tax collector do that the Pharisee doesn't? He admits he's a sinner. He doesn't say, look at me, look at how righteous I am, right? He says, no, have mercy on me, a sinner. And who does Jesus say goes away justified by God? The tax collector. The Pharisees are standing right there. And they are well known for going out on the street corner and praying out loud to show their holiness, to show their devotion, to show their piety. So Jesus is saying, yeah, no, that's not, you've got your reward, right? Any questions on these two? On the second one? Okay. So, because we're interested in the language stuff, do you know the Bible's actually written in 3 languages, not 2?
Hebrew initially, right?
So the first 2/3, we'll call it, first 2/3 of the Old Testament are written in Hebrew. Okay? The last third or so the later prophets of the Old Testament are written in Aramaic. Yep. And then the last, in fact, like with the 100% of the New Testament is written in Greek. There is some speculation that Matthew has 2 different versions to it. So Matthew specifically has a Hebrew version that was then translated into Greek, because its construction is really weird. And that's kind of the way that we can explain it, is that Matthew originally wrote it in Hebrew, and it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, or he translated, he translated it from Hebrew into Greek. And that's why it's a little weird in its construction. The Greek is really, it's hard to get through sometimes. There's another, which tends to be, it's thought to be the earliest gospel. We like to think Mark is the earliest gospel, but really Matthean priority is what it's called. It's kind of taken center stage because of how much, how early we want to date that. So if Matthew is the first one, then it gets priority in terms of being the earliest. Hebrews is another one of those books that seems to be more like a sermon that could have been delivered in Hebrew, but the writer, instead of writing it in Hebrew, translates as he's listening into Greek. Again, which is why it kind of sounds, in the Greek, it kind of reads weird. So, but we don't have Hebrew Matthew. That's just a hypothesis, and it's a pretty good one that we can be confident in. And we don't have Hebrew Hebrews, which is, again, it's something we can kind of have some confidence in, but all we have are the Greek manuscripts that have survived of these two. So later prophets like Malachi are in Aramaic. All right. Earlier prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, those are all in Hebrew. The Torah is in Hebrew. The histories, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Esther, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, those are all in Hebrew. It's only kind of the latter prophets, kind of the post-Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian captivity prophets that are writing in Aramaic. Yeah. Anyway, any questions on that? Because it's kind of an interesting, it's a fascinating little thing about how we get the Bible. About the last third in terms of books, not in terms of content. Yeah. But yeah, we don't have any what we do have is we have a lot of Greek. So we know that it was written in Greek, but then you have differing sources, like you have the Peshitta, which is kind of it's another language translation that we find in Africa that is really cool. That it would have been a translation of the Greek into that language. So we have a really cool document history as far as the tradition is concerned.
I know when you're reading Hebrews, you can definitely tell that the author wasn't Paul.
Right. So there's for Hebrews, there's kind of three different authors that people like to talk about, or three different potentials. There's Paul, which is kind of the traditional answer, but it still leaves us with a question mark, right? Because it doesn't read like Paul. It doesn't read like any of his other stuff. So that's why they're saying, well, it could have been a sermon he delivered in Hebrew that was transliterated by one of his guys, or translated rather, by one of his guys into Greek. Okay? Luke is another guy that we say could have written it, but here's the problem. Luke is a Gentile. Okay? He doesn't speak Hebrew. He speaks Greek. He might speak Latin. So again, this leaves a big question mark because it's very like he knows he's got because of his training as a doctor. He does a lot of really good history work. He's one of the prime examples of an ancient Near Eastern historian. But Luke doesn't really fit the bill. The person that seems to fit the bill the best is Apollos. But again, we can't say for sure. Apollos, you remember who Apollos was?
Yeah.
He's a disciple of Paul who has a real heart for, he's a Jew. So he speaks Hebrew, he speaks Aramaic, he speaks Greek, because this was written in Greek. So it could be that he's the one who wrote it. And he's from Alexandria, Apollos is. So Apollos writes in a very specific style called the Alexandrian style. It's a style of argumentation. And that's exactly the form that we see in Hebrews. It's an Alexandrian style argument. Kind of like you can tell, like when you look at a poem, you can tell the form of a sonnet. Right? Sonnets have a very specific form. Haikus are a poem that have a very specific form. When we talk about like logic and philosophy, when we make an argument, it takes a very specific form. So proposition 1, proposition 2, and your conclusion. We can tell that that's what's called a syllogism because of the form that it takes. So we can recognize based on how that book is written that it's an Alexandrian style argument, which is something Apollos would have been very familiar with, having been educated in Alexandria. So some pretty strong evidence that Apollos wrote it. But we can't say for sure, and it almost didn't make it into our canon because it doesn't tell us who wrote it. You know what other book almost didn't make it into the canon? Not for that reason, but because it's so weird. Revelation almost didn't make it into the canon. But, yeah. Anyway. All right. Well, I will see you all next week. And like I said, if Ken Kemper decides he doesn't want to do Sunday school, we'll start the Beatitudes. Or I would start the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. So.